Good. So we're just giving everyone the last minute to get into the room from the nice break. And then we're going to kick off on a discussion related to the local and international market access. And then obviously technologies and maybe some reforms that are required to facilitate this. So there's going to be an aspect of this discussion that's going to be very much focused on how it is currently, and then also what needs to potentially happen to facilitate access and more successful commercialization domestically. So I think let's kick it off to the next slide so we can go for a bit of an overview. So I always like to start with just a very direct explanation of how the product differentials or the product SKUs are defined within cannabis, because when we know the differences, it makes it a lot easier to see how these products tie into the value chain. In addition, I will talk to the current success in the local market, what is working, what is required for us to really grow as an economy based on cannabis, and then looking at the international, more specifically the medical market. But if we do what we need to in the local market, we will very easily be able to participate in international adult use markets when they are open to imports. And then obviously, what are the restraints on international markets? We talked about offtakes, we talked about a few things. So there's quite a lot to be said about the restrictions and restraints. And then lastly, what does success ultimately look like in the industry? So I think let's jump into a bit of an overview here. A lot of individuals have seen these type of products in the market. In South Africa, just to always bring it back to what is legal and what's not, we know that CBD products are, provided they're under 600 or 600 milligrams, 20 milligrams per dose. We know that THC products can be sold via prescription. So this goes through the Section 21 regulatory framework, where you can source local products as well as international products, but these are medicinal products. So they should have the appropriate classification for that. And I'll describe what that classification is shortly. Essentially, the biggest thing I want to highlight, besides all the edible products, the infused beverages that are in the market, specifically Canada and certain states in the US, there's a distinction between flower. So when we talk about floss, inflorescence, or flower, there's really two types. There's what's called the prescription flower, which is like a Bedrocan model of flower, which has always been the main product in the Netherlands and distributed throughout Europe. Increasingly, the Canadians have competed into that market as well in terms of supplying what is called the registered or prescription flower. The difference here is there's a lot of testing associated to it. When we talk about medicinal flower in the US, we often refer to just a dispensary and license method around that. It's not as heavily tested for aflatoxins, pesticides in all the states. It's not as uniform, so there isn't a harmonization of standards. So I'm going to start using the term more prescription cannabis to define that framework for medicinal cannabis, because to say medicinal cannabis it's erroneous, because the difference between a recreational product and a medicinal product is the same product. It has the same benefits for your health in general. So prescription cannabis really speaks to the fact that it goes through a very controlled manufacturing process as well as a testing process to define the product. Additionally, there are products like GW Pharmaceuticals Epidiolex. This was the first FDA registered product in 2018. This is what really opened up the industry in terms of research, acceptance within the mainstream, because once the FDA had approved it for epilepsy and other indications, it really started to change the paradigm for a lot of top academics and researchers, saying, no, there is clear cannabinoid benefits. It's been established by the Israelis for a very long time. Let's look at this as an industry, and that's kind of now matured. So I think let's jump to the next slide. The rest is all adult use products, but I would like to just give you guys a bit of a framework in terms of how the next slide will define the architecture of thinking. So I always define it in three product classes. So the first one, if we go right up to medical, it should be prescription cannabis. So let's use that term. It's really the split here between two types of products, a registered product and an unregistered product. So what I mean by a registered product, I'm referring to an Epidiolex type product. It's a traditional pharmaceutical product that has essentially gone through clinical trial evaluation for an indication. It's been manufactured via GACP, which is good agricultural and collection practices for sourcing of a botanical herbal product, and it's then possibly been processed further through GMP, which is good manufacturing practices. Or often GMP stands for good get more paper in the industry, because it's really about just validating everything. The environment needs to be validated, the HVAC, the rooms, the humidifiers, dehumidifiers, everything that could affect the impact of the environment and the product is what we define and characterize. So you can imagine there's a lot of traceability and paper. So in addition to that, we have the need for definition of a dossier for that product. We'll have batch manufacturing records, we'll have a marketing authorization for the product in the jurisdiction, and we will have testing that goes with it. Now, Epidiolex is not, you've seen earlier from Dr. Kale's presentation, there isn't a marketing authorization for Schedule 6 product or Schedule 4 in the country, primarily because you're allowed to grow it at home in your private use. So economically, from a drug manufacturer's point of view, how sustainable is the market in South Africa? So there's a benefit to decriminalization, being that, yes, you can do it at home now, but in terms of certain commercial interests in the country, it becomes a little harder because when everyone can grow their medicine at home, a drug manufacturer might not pursue a marketing authorization. So that wraps us up on the registered product side. There are companies looking to register their own products domestically, but let's go to unregistered medicine. Now, unregistered medicine is essentially 90% of the cannabis art in the medical space. Essentially, what you need here is you need a lot of strong ties to the local regulator, whether that's in Canada, different states. It's a little tougher in the US because it's federally legal, and there's the states that then regulate. But if you look at Germany, Israel, you need a relationship with the regulator, and here in South Africa with SAPRA, because we are enabling access to what's traditionally a product without a dossier and without a marketing authorization. So in this space, it comes to special access schemes. So in South Africa, we refer to what's called Section 21. A Section 21 is where a prescriber can then say, I would like to give my patient cannabis for a specific indication that I'll be monitoring over the course of the next 6 months. I will provide feedback to the regulator, and then that feedback is compiled by the regulator for greater evaluation. That has been taking off in the last 6 months in South Africa. I think we're in a few hundred patients already. So that's fantastic, because what happens here, and I think this is important to state, is I'm an advocate of medical access through unregistered pathways, because when you get to 1,000, you get to 2,000 medical patients, the lobby shifts in terms of access to why is it that certain individuals with access to money and capital can get the same medicine that you can grow at home and we can't. So this becomes a lobby issue for me, and we've seen this in Canada and the US, is the more medical patients we onboard, the more scientific data and evidence there is for its safety and use, and the sooner we can lobby and petition stakeholders in government to open up a more inclusive pathway. So we've seen something like that with ivermectin, where they moved to Section 14. Ideally, we could see cannabis even move to Section 14, where any physician could prescribe it on the basis of compassionate care. So these are the kind of regulatory loopholes we're trying to push for, to enable better access. And it's not because we want to keep it as a medicine. We want to exploit the medical benefits, but if we do this successfully and we get to a critical mass for patients, we can really start to have the adult use conversation in a more robust sense. So that's basically some of the points. There's still got to be a monograph defined for that product. We haven't seen a monograph specifically that's been published, but it would probably align with the Dutch and German monographs to some extent in terms of how to define the quality of the input product through Section 21. So let's go to CBD wellness. This is where we've seen a proliferation in South Africa. We are a bit fortunate in this regard. Not a lot of jurisdictions allow for CBD products to just be marketed like we do in South Africa. If you look at Australia, those markets go through quite an intense process. If you look at the UK, there's quite a strong focus on novel foods. This is where the novel food legislation can be inhibitive, because when you start going to novel foods, there's a need. If you look at the US, there's a clear need for novel foods, because everywhere, you can go to any gas station in the States, you can walk in anywhere and you get any type of cannabis or edible you want. So the reality is there needs to be some kind of control and testing. So in that regulated market for wellness products, there should be label claims. There should be someone checking that the label claims conform to what's specified on the product. We should be having product recalls and call-ups that if there is a product and it's got a deficiency, we will see recalls for that product. And then it also relates to the degree of scheduling. So scheduling is market specific. CBD in South Africa is obviously Schedule 4 for higher quantities of CBD, and Schedule 0 complementary medicines for 600 milligrams and 20 milligrams per dose. Now, the unregulated market is where we see all the innovation, and the only issue with that is it's offset by uncertainty. So if you're studying a product with 3,000 milligrams of CBD, you do run the risk of a product call-up being implemented, and when it does, you're going to have a problem. I think one of the issues that has stifled product recalls in the market or call-ups is the issues around testing, and we'll talk a bit about it, because if you cannot get proficiency testing between labs, how do you expect to regulate a market? And I think this is critical in terms of government's need to focus on where they need to support the industry. I think testing is highly overlooked, and subsidizing testing is really important to enable the industry. And then let's go to adult use. I mean, this is really policy driven. It is 90% of the global market. So when we talk about a serious cannabis economy outside of hemp, because that's more industrial, we have to start looking at adult use. It's almost foolish to believe that adult use will never be a factor. Every mature medical market eventually starts to shift towards responsible adult use. So the question is, how do we enable access responsibly? And what can we put in from a societal perspective? So that, I mean, people have access to alcohol, people have access to cigarettes. These are not, restricted. So how do we put good measures in place so that there's realistic access and it doesn't just have to be through medical prescription? So that is a discussion that is a mature discussion, because let's remember something. There is an illicit market always, which means it's not like we are doing something that isn't being done. It's been done already. There is a very extensive network of illicit operators. And I would rather consume a product in that is regulated, that I know what's in the product, that there aren't excessive heavy metals, there's not pesticides. Long term for my health and the health of the consumer of the nation, we need to start getting some kind of structures in place so we can protect product quality. And that's basically all that's driven around there. There's a lot of brand differentiation, testing is required. So let's go to the next slide and we'll start to unpack what is working successfully locally and then what we can do in terms of next steps. So now anyone who's been to the cannabis expos, that's been to the ones in Joburg, Durban, Cape Town, there's a flourishing industry. A lot of what's happening in that industry is considered still illicit or in grey areas for the most part, but there is substantial economic investment that's already taken place. So let's talk about Section 21. This is where I've discussed earlier that a physician can write you in for medical access. This is growing nicely, month on month. Me personally, I'd love to see this get to 2,000-3,000 patients, and then it becomes a lobby discussion, like I've discussed. How do we enable broader access? So that is working, and it's good to see it working because we've been petitioning for a very long time to enable access. I remember the first Section 21s were Canadian products that were coming into the market, and we had last put up a stink about it in terms of the regulator, like, why are we using Canadian products when we have local flower? So I've been quite vocal about the use of local industry when we can for medical inputs, and luckily I've seen a good diversification of that. There's been some good discussions with the providers for these schemes and the rest. Complementary medicines for CBD, that's done pretty well. I think it's saturated. It's kind of hit its maximum impact on society. I think we need to see product differentiation for CBD to go anywhere else. I think there is a bit of a gray market, or there's something called the Directorate of Food Control, which regulates through an act for food, cosmetics, and disinfectants. Theoretically, food products should go through the Directorate of Food Control and should have input from that agency under the Department of Health. It still, however, sits with SAPRA for the most part, and there is a debate there to be had about the regulator or the Directorate of Food Control could start putting up their hand and say, look, the CBD chocolate, CBD water, that's our problem. It's got nothing to do with the medical regulator if we want to move it from that scheduling. So there has to be that debate almost, and I've seen from that department, they're just leaving it. They're happy to have SAPRA run of it, but I don't think it's actually in the interest of consumers, because how can you have a CBD product that's in chocolate if there is a manufactured in a GMP environment? Did it have a pharmacist at the chocolatier? I don't think so. So those products already have some direct conflicts with the route to administration for complementary medicine. You cannot have a chocolatier have GMP as well as a responsible pharmacist. So those products already tell us something about the quality. So that's something just to highlight. The private model. Now, this has been an interesting discussion. The Haze Club ruling, you guys might have heard about it in the media. We need to hit a decision on this. The government has been postponing the ruling for the Haze Club because they know that when they do reach a decision, it's going to set a new precedent for the legal interpretation of private clubs. Now, private clubs have popped up everywhere. It's still in that gray zone. There's been limited prosecution at best. The model is basically predicated on your privacy, where if I do not want to grow or trade in cannabis, I pay someone for the service or the rental to grow on my behalf, and therefore I'm paying for services related to the plant and not actually transacting directly in the plant. And then what I do is I pay for my rental service, I fetch my product, and I'm not directly transacting. you can see how that's a slippery slope. You know, it's a bit of a gray area because, you know, it's same as if you have a storage locker, it's your private space. So what's happening in that storage locker is your privacy. So it kind of ties into that discussion. So hopefully we'll see a ruling. I think the NPA and the rest will just postpone till they've formed legislation that then will coincide with a ruling that relates to the private clubs. In terms of the best growth I've seen, and this is often overlooked, people always say, how do I get into cannabis? Go into the support industry. The amount of growth I've seen from companies and distributors around home growing systems, lights, tents, substrates, nutrients, pH meters, you name it, as well as for commercial growers, greenhouses, rolling benches, an array of lights, controlled automated systems. This is where most of the growth has been, because it also de-risks you to some extent, because you're not touching the plant directly. So this has really been where I've seen the most sustainable growth, is in the space. It will plateau, obviously, but it is something that people often overlook. They talk about, I want to sell cannabis, or I want to formulate cannabis. Well, why don't you get involved in the support industry, get involved in the education related to it? Because when it is more accepted in terms of an adult use market, we will see massive opportunities continue in the space. So let's jump to the future of responsible adult use. Now, I have a strong medical background. Most of my clients until today are mostly medical clients, pharmaceutical manufacturers, but I would like to start talking now on the next slide about adult use, because I think it's important to enable it. One of the first things that we've been pushing for is incubators in special economic zones, or even in certain clusters, where there's a regulatory sandbox for that. What does this mean? There are certain governments around the world with certain technologies where they've given regulatory exclusion to certain areas that are predefined. Now, this is important. Why? Because it allows you to start doing research and development outside of the scope of a regulated environment. I'll use the CSR maybe as an example here. I mean, technically, if we're going to look at it objectively, there might be a mandate saying you need a Section 22C1B license for the manufacture or anything related to pharmaceutical release. You might also need a narcotic handling permit. Now, these are things you negate when you start having like something like an SEZ, special economic zone with a regulatory sandbox, because then people can experiment in that SEZ, define products, reiterate and develop products to the world-class standard. And then when the rest of the country is ready to enable legislation, that SEZ has then done a lot of that R&D and product development. And this is something that just requires almost a pen stroke from a high-level minister to actually look to give this little regulatory exclusion. And I think it's a model that may be sustainable while we're finding our feet. It would have been great if this was done 2 years ago, because then we would have already had a lot of product development in the pipeline. The next thing that moves to adult use is, I want to talk to how do we enable successful adult use? It comes down to a bit on the licensing, and I will talk about local retail licenses. We have seen that cannabis cultivation is not being inclusive. It's predominantly been, monopolized by white capital. I'm just going to be honest about it because I deal with these clients. And the reality is, if we want to be more inclusive, we've got to start looking at retail as well, because you can put certain measures in place at the retail level, but you can have previously disadvantaged communities, you can have rastas included, preferentially priced in for the retail side. And this would enable them to then essentially provide to the consumer at the face level, their products. Now, in terms of sourcing, 100% sorted, because we already have almost 60 licenses that have gone through a very stringent process as a medical facility, right? Getting licensed, going for QMS, having to test their products, having to source the genetics. So we do have sourcing handled. We can make that more inclusive, and that goes back to the aggregated models discussed by Blessed. There is a way to start becoming inclusive, and we can talk about it. There's also the need for what is called a PT scheme between labs. The labs are not at the point where it's ideal. It's 50% there. There are 2 accredited labs for testing for specifically cannabinoids. There's a couple other labs that are really good, that aren't necessarily just into the GLP side of it, that are working on the ISO 17025. But you give it a year or 2, we could, with SANAS's help, have a proficient testing environment for the entire industry. So that's on its way. In terms of retail licenses, it hasn't been discussed. It has been discussed, but it hasn't been ratified or formalized. This is where we need to start putting in legislation. How will access to the consumer work? Age restrictions, right? Licensing. Those license providers will have to source a tested and compliant product. There will be limits on how much can be sold to any given individual. These are the kind of discussions that need to be defined, because this is how we start opening up responsible adult use access, right? Next one is product diversification. We are predominantly seeing flower. We've spoken about this today. We need to start enabling extractors and processing and formulation teams to start working on defining products. If you want to be successful internationally as well, you need to have a product that is correlates in terms of stability of the product, the nano formulation of the product, bioavailability of the product. These are the type of industries we need to push. And this is also where you're going to see the most net return in terms of profitability in the space, because you're adding differential factors and proprietary formulation to the products. So for me, this is the structure I see. The issue is inclusion. So how do we get, I know Molemo is going to speak as a black cultivator that's licensed, like, where do we get communities involved? Well, it has to go to a central aggregator. They would have to be subsidized for testing by the government or some state entity, because it is expensive to test, and there would have to be a minimum threshold on the quantities. You would need to make it that it needs to be 10 kilograms, because testing is expensive. So if we can do that, then we allow for aggregation in certain provinces. We allow for testing where the revenues from a retail licensing scheme can be taxed at the consumer point, right? Like we do with cigarettes and alcohol with a sin tax. And then we use that tax revenue not to pay for new ministers' Porsches or Ferraris, but to actually be used to test and subsidize testing. And I think that's great, because then it also builds our ability to scientifically demonstrate that the products are world class. So for me, that's the framework I see for local markets. Next slide, we'll talk quickly international, because I do think it's a bit saturated the discussion on international. But I just like to highlight the route to international supply chain is pretty clear. I mean, the Udrelex Volume 4 has defined it in detail, specifically Annex 7 on the manufacture of herbal medicinal products. At what point in the process do we apply good agricultural intellectual practices to botanicals? And then how do we migrate that into a more controlled environment and the GMP for the dry, the cure, and the final pack of the product? If that product's going to receive further post-processing, they would also take place in the GMP environment. And this essentially enables you to get a better plant type product or specific extract that's being manufactured in a very controlled manner. Good. So the next slide, I think let's talk limitations related to the international market, because this was being brought up today as well regarding offtake. I mean, this is a challenge. When you deal with an offtake, it's a relationship, and people often misunderstand this. An offtake is nothing more than a relationship. If I was the company buying your product or your flower, let's just use flower because it's easier than we talk oil and the rest. But if I'm going to purchase your flower from South Africa and I'm in Germany, I have to ask certain questions about my prescriber network. My physicians want to provide a product that's safe and tested. How good is this testing in your country? Questionable, we've got a problem. Okay, we can test it in Germany, so we've solved the problem. Right, next question is, how consistent is your product? If you're growing it in multiple different environments, and this maybe speaks to maybe when we talk about local product sourcing being more inclusive, it's difficult for international exports. And this is where a lot of these discussions about inclusion fall flat, because most of our model is focused on export, correct? So if we make it domestic, we can talk about inclusivity, because now you can have a variety of products, because it's for a variety of desires by the consumer. When we talk medical, we talk about stability, consistency, the same product. I can't have a dosage form that keeps changing. So that's why I often feel, and I've often said to stakeholders in government, is like, you have to understand that the current focus on export is going to kill your inclusivity locally. You have to understand that that's recreational, that there is going to be variety. People want to try the Malawi Gold, the Swazi or Durban Poison, and they want to try from different growers. That's recreational. Medical market's about relationship and consistency. So here we need to have probably larger facilities growing the same strain year on year, harvest and harvest, because when a physician provides it for an indication, a patient gets acclimated to it, they expect the same quality in 6 months' time, as they keep repeating their doses. And now that is not available. And this is where people see like the gelatos and all the different types of strains in California, and it looks all exciting, but that's not medical. It gets framed in California as medical, but that's not prescription cannabis. Prescription cannabis is about consistency. And there an off-taker wants to see stability related to your testing after you cultivate it. So you put it in a chamber, it sits there. After 6 months, you pull a sample. After a year, you pull the sample. And then based on the stability, degradation of the product, You know how stable the shelf life is. Therefore, your label claims can be substantiated. And I think the thing you need to understand about medical markets is product recall is very much going to define the next 2 years of medical cannabis. Because people are going to realize that the products have microbial problems, they have label specification problems, and they're going to keep asking for more and more stringency. And that's not conducive with co-ops. It's conducive to big ag and consistency within big consistent cultivation. The other issue is, I will say this in terms of the local market, there's just a lack of planning. And this comes from a pharmaceutical background for me. I very rarely have I ever received a URS. If I tell anyone in the cannabis space, have you done a URS on the equipment? They'll look at me and be like, what are you talking about? What is a URS? And now, if you don't know what that is, it's a user requirement specification. It's essentially defining what the equipment needs to do, what it needs to be built from to meet your regulatory requirements. And this is important in the pharmaceutical world. So it's a requirement of GMP. You know, if you're going to have a Section 22C 1B license from SAHPRA, you need to understand the regulatory demand around QBD, quality by design, and URSs. And I've never seen this. 1 or 2 exceptions. And those are the 1 or 2 exceptions that have been successful in the market because they come from that background, understanding the need for consistency and the effect manufacturing can have on your product. Again, consistency relates to prescriptions. The stringency relates to heavy metals. I know I had a discussion of NAPs that we recorded and put on YouTube. There they say 50% of the products had heavy metals above the minimum requirement. And because of the history of South Africa in open cast mining, heavy metals is a problem. It's also the benefit of hemp. Industrial hemp can be used to sequester heavy metals and capture that from the ground. But be careful, because when you open up consumer products in the same areas near mine dumps, there's going to be long-term adverse effects of metals. And the thing people often overlook, and I hear this often, is no one died from cannabis. I smoked cannabis all my life. I haven't gone dead. But let's just remember something. The accumulation of heavy metals over time is what slowly kills you. Same with pesticides. And this is what you need to remember. It's not about tomorrow. It's not about next month, next year. It's about a decade, 2 decades from now. Those products in your body are carcinogenic. We've seen this from the industry. I'll use an example related to food. I've heard of studies where since the introduction of preservatives in food, corpses are taking like a decade longer to decompose because of all the preservatives that start to move into the body. So that shows you, like, if our corpses are taking longer to decompose, the impact of preservatives in food. And it's not obvious at first. It becomes obvious as you get metadata. So it's really important for us to appreciate that. And I think it's important for government to understand that nuance when it comes to why we talk about testing. Right, so then for me, it essentially comes down to also the need for regulatory reform. There's certain things that government should have done. Testing labs should not be needed to get a permit when it comes to reference standards for cannabinoids. It's ridiculous. Like, if we know that testing is a linchpin to the industry being successful, insisting that every single person who does a cannabis test with a reference standard needs a permit is just foolish. What is the risk of diversion of a highly, a reference standard is so expensive compared to you sourcing it from the illicit market. It's not even comparable. No one would use a reference standard for personal consumption. So there is no risk of diversion. It's foolish. And this is something that immediately should be changed. I've said this before and I'll say it again. Reference standards need to be provided to a qualified lab on demand, no issues, no permits. It is ludicrous to think it's going into a diversionary framework. There's so much cannabis out there, I can walk down to any rank and get it. Why would I go get an expensive USP standard and use that? It's ridiculous. So for me, it impedes the industry very directly, and it impedes what we all say. And this is what stakeholders say. They want to know more data. They want to see more research. They want to have more testing. Well, then allow testing. Don't impose permits on testing. That's ridiculous. So I'm going to move off that. But essentially, this would also enable us. We need to look at how we're going to improve access to extraction and formulation. We talked earlier about the GMP differentials. GMP is not a universal thing. There's GMP for food. In the US, it's 110. For dietary supplements, 111. And for pharma, it's 210, 211. We can have a GMP standard or a HACCP standard for certain products where it's appropriate, and a different standard for specifically medical products that are looking for marketing authorization. And if we can distinguish that, and SAHPRA is willing to distinguish that difference, then we end up in a situation where we can actually have sustainable extraction, because not everyone's trying to make a natural product that's a dronabinol, something of that sort, or trying to create something of that line. We're not all trying to get marketing authorizations. The drug development cycle is so long that it's ludicrous to think that. So we need to enable local access for processing and agro-processing. So onto the last slide. Yeah, basically, what does success look like? I mean, I'm going to just refer to the current framework, which is medical. So let's just talk medical for a moment. I believe more than that, but we need to always, and I think this applies not just to medical, but every product. What is your product release? If you know what your final commercial product is, then work backwards. It doesn't have to be a distillate, an isolate, flower. Define that well. Stay focused. Very often I see cultivators and teams that they can do everything. The moment a client tells me they can do everything, I'm like, no, I'm going to walk away from this. Because if you're trying to do too many things, especially in this space, you're going to invariably burn out. There's just too many, it's too specialized. And it's evolving so quickly. Like there is no such thing as an expert in cannabis. The industry is moving so quickly that we're all learning every second of the day. You can go to any webinar, any podcast, and you'll keep learning. There really is no expertise. We are trying to stabilize a new economy around cannabis, and it will take time. Understand your manufacturing constraints, understand quality, understand aspects of GMP. The guidelines are there. It's just maybe the interpretation of the regulator that you need to debate. Start training for quality. Like look at things like stability. Do more tests, because the more data you have, the easier it's going to be for you to mitigate product recall in the future. Look at your raw material sourcing and licensing. Understand the quality of your biomass. Know the difference between a control union standard. Know the difference between certain GAP, GCP, GACP standards. So go and audit your cultivators if you're going to do a tertiary product. Go see the facility. And then the last thing I'd say is accept a lot of risk. This is very different from me coming from a more traditional pharmaceutical background. The risk is everywhere in cannabis. You've got legislative risks, you've got commercial risks, you've got competitors like Colombia. Everyone is in the same global economy. Like there are massive risks to this space. There could be massive reward, but it does require us all to spend a lot of time petitioning and lobbying to allow for effective structures. And question all market assumptions. Like there is no set price at any given. It keeps changing. It will keep coming down probably. And then on the last side, I've basically just included a resource center. I do try to put a lot of conversations out onto YouTube. I know that Prof. Materia has also been doing a fantastic job on, as an academic, sharing information with, not just on cannabis, but on a multitude of African herbal botanicals. And this is what we're all trying to do is, I think the best way to drive the industry is to break down the silos. I mean, often big pharmaceutical gets seen as, you have this agenda. And I do agree there is an agenda. But at the same time, there are players within the pharmaceutical industry that want to see inclusion. They want to see people brought into the industry, and they want to see the development of the sector. Because if you're in a silo, you cannot develop an industry in a silo, right? You need to collaborate, and you need to work with other industry experts and stakeholders to be able to build an industry. And then if you get your 5% of that industry, that's amazing. Having 100% control of an industry that doesn't exist is ridiculous. So there is a need for collaboration. It's great to see Prof. Materia as well as the CSIR has done a lot of good conversations on the YouTube channel. I like YouTube because when you personally want to solve a problem, I just go onto YouTube and Google how to, and I find it. So for me, I'm not a big academic kind of focus on publishing and doing all the lists of references. I do research my content. I do speak to a lot of industry involved with, but I like digital, visual. I mean, people do not read, in my opinion. People will not read articles I send them. So I send them videos, and even then, half of them don't watch the videos. So then I'm like, you're not interested. Then let's move on, find a different industry, and then we move from there. So thank you everyone for the time. Let's open up to maybe some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much.